So, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, we want to warmly welcome you here to SIPRI at this event this evening. Thank you for coming. And we have a special and very timely discussion this evening. We will be thinking and talking security. It will not be easy, but I'm relieved that we have a very knowledgeable panel with us here who will guide us through these next 90 minutes. I also want to warmly welcome our audiences online. And we are, in a moment, welcoming our first panelist on stage. This is SIPRI Director Dan Smith. He's my boss at SIPRI, obviously. And it's fair to say he has a lifetime history of experience in peace and security issues, ranging from nuclear to ecology issues, and regionally from the Balkans to Africa to North Asia. And Dan will in a moment set the scene for us for tonight's discussion with a brief keynote speech. And thereafter I will invite our other two panelists on stage, but I will introduce you now already who they are, so then you can see them in real life in a moment. And that will be Dr. Line Gordon. You also see here on the picture. Line, you're the director of the Stockholm Resilience Center, and you're also a professor of sustainability science at Stockholm University with a focus on ecology, water, and food issues. Warm welcome. And also welcome to you, Robert Egnell. You're the Vice-Chancellor of the Swedish Defence University, and you're a professor of leadership, command, and control. And you have a long experience in conflict research, and especially also in the effectiveness, for example, in peace operations. So we have a broad range of expertise here tonight. And of course, you in the audience, you're also very important to us. We will bring you into the discussion. And those of you online, we also want to hear your questions and your views. So please email us at events@sipri.org. We will watch the space. So yes, Dan, welcome to take the stage.
Thank you. Oh, well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction. Thank you all for being here and taking the time to come this afternoon. And thank you also, Robert and Line, for being willing to come up here and join on the panel. So what we wanted to do was to be, as the title says, thinking security in times that are obviously changing and challenging. We all know that. But more importantly, some of the challenges and some of the changes are unprecedented. Literally so, they have not been experienced before. And that also means that in the security field, some of the combinations of challenge and change are also new. And when things are new, you know, there's a tendency amongst institutions to interpret problems in the light of what they are experienced with. And there are good reasons for doing that. There are good reasons why we do it as individuals. But you also sometimes, when you try to interpret the new and respond to it in the light of your experience, you can be missing out some important things. So I want to look into this area with the aim of outlining, first of all, how I see the broad shape of security challenges and ways of thinking about them. And secondly, I want to focus on the content of one aspect in particular, which is the issue of ecological security. I'm going to concentrate about half my talk on. And then some thoughts about what to do next, because, you know, unfortunately, I can never see a problem without thinking about how to respond to it. So if we think security, cast our minds back 30, 40 years ago, if you said security policy, security studies, you knew what you were talking about, right? You're talking about uniforms and tanks and missiles and weapons. You're talking about conflict. And you're talking about peace, defined as the absence of those kinds of conflicts and that kind of violence. So security, good. And then in 1994, the UN Development Programme's Human Development Report brought up a new notion to bother us all with, human security. And human security was interpreted differently by different people, but it certainly included those kind of aspects of human well-being that, if they are put at risk, might lead into grievance and conflict. And then also got us thinking about the aftermath of violent conflict and what aspects of human well-being needed to be looked after. So it's out of the notion of human security that then comes ideas like peace building and inclusivity in peace processes and so on. And now, when we think about security, and this is something that a problem that I have contributed to adding to your burden of woes over the past 15 years, is to think about the impact of climate change upon insecurity. But I want to now to broaden that frame even a little bit more and not just be talking about climate change, but talking about a broader range of environmental problems. So all of these three strands, national security, human security, and ecological security, I think need to be taken seriously. Right? And if nothing else, if we learn nothing else from the last year and a bit, surely that's what we learn. 2022 is, of course, it's the year of the war in Ukraine. It's the year of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This has been grabbing everybody's attention. It is not actually the most violent war of the current period. That's probably Ethiopia. It is far from the only war of the current period. There are 55 other countries in which there are armed conflicts during 2022. But war, conflict, insurgency, terrorism, confrontation, rivalries, arms races, the tension over Taiwan, increasing confrontation between the US and China in Northeast Asia and the Southeast Asian waters, the decline of arms control, the importance of peace operations, the way in which at least one alliance is expanding and other alliances, other great powers are trying to build as well. This is the real thing, right? If for the last 2.5 to 3 decades before 2022, we thought that some of these issues were becoming less important. We saw, for example, in the 1990s, world military spending decline from about $1.5 trillion in 1990 to just under $1 trillion by the end of that decade. If we saw over the past 30 years how the number of nuclear weapons declined from about 75,000 at the end of the Cold War, 75,000 warheads worldwide, to around 12,500 now. If we thought that this was all good news, if we saw the number of wars declining from 1990, when there were 50, to 2010, when there were about 30. This is all good news. Did this mean that all of this area of national security was becoming less important? If that's what we thought, and if we thought we could move on to other issues, we were wrong. We were badly wrong. The number of wars has doubled in the last decade and a bit. The number of people killed in war during the second decade of this century is twice what it was in the first decade. The number of refugees by 2020 was twice what it was in 2010, and it's increased again. So national security is a real issue, and 2022 taught us that. Right? 2022 is also the year, in case anybody has forgotten, of the devastating impact of the effects of climate change. A once in a 500-year drought in Europe, that's how the EU depicted it. The worst and most widespread drought in China since systematic records began, which admittedly is only 6 or 7 decades ago, but nonetheless, it's a serious event. 35% of Pakistan inundated in floods. Areas of the Horn of Africa, if one area had a drought, the next door area had a flood. And so wildfires, and so on. So national security is absolutely fundamental, yes. So let's move on to human security. Has that become less important because national security has come back into our gaze more? I have to tell you, I was at a conference recently, a couple of weeks ago, which I think really, it wasn't, I have to say that it was not just the boys. It was the girls as well. Sorry. visibly excited and comforted by the right which had been given them to return to what so many of them described as the core issues of security. Now stopping having to worry about all of this other stuff, about civil war and inequalities and grievances and food insecurity and all of that, right? Stop thinking about all of those other issues and focus on national security. And if that's what anybody is thinking, they are wrong. Because those issues, the rise in inequality in the world, the rise in food insecurity. I mean, for 2.5 decades until 2015, world hunger was declining. Since 2015, it started to increase. It was given a boost by the pandemic, and the figures all got worse, and now there's been another increase in the indicators of food insecurity because of the effects of the war in Ukraine and of the sanctions. So, I mean, there's no doubt that those issues which were raised under the heading of human security remain, or should remain, as central to our thinking as is possible. Right? And this is where the challenge of thinking security starts. Because what your head wants to know is, well, which is the fundamental one? Is it national security that's fundamental, or is it human security that's fundamental? And the answer is yes. And then there's ecological insecurity. So there's the impact of climate change. And we understand now, I think, more about the pathways, I'll come to that lead from climate change to violent conflict. There's other ecological disruptions as well, which I also want to talk about, leading to things like the loss of soil quality and to water insecurity, which have an impact then on the food and the hunger problems, which then connect to social grievance, which lead to political instability, social upheaval, and onto the risk of violent conflict, and in some cases to actual open violent conflict, open war. So, from my perspective, and I will explain this third part of it a little bit more detail in a moment, if you think that ecological or environmental security is a kind of new wacky idea and we don't need to bother about it because it's complicated enough to think about national security and human security, well then that's wrong too. Right? If one is to think security, one needs to think all three of these: national security, human security, ecological security. It's one security space in which these issues exist. Think of it perhaps as a triangle with 3 points, right? Or 3 sides to the triangle. These are the issues which make for security or insecurity. These are the issues which, if we get right, we have peace and prosperity and well-being, and if we get wrong, we have instability and everything negative. But they're not separate issues. That's maybe the most complicated part of it. This is where, instead of thinking about a triangle, perhaps you want to think about a Venn diagram. Oh, I've got to get out of the light now. It's the sweet spot in the middle. Or perhaps it's not a sweet spot, perhaps it's the sour spot in the middle, which we really need to be thinking about if we're thinking about security. How do these problems overlap and interact with each other? Maybe you can take that off now so that I don't get dazzled by the light. I mean, life in the spotlight is fine, but there are limits to it. So let's focus a little bit on ecological security. This, as I said, this is more or less the second half of my talk. I've tried to set up the 3 things, and by focusing on ecological security, I don't want to suggest that, despite everything I said, I'm downplaying the other 2. It's just that for the first 20 years of my professional career, I wrote about national security. And for the next 20 years of my professional career, I wrote about human security. And for the last decade, oh God, I'm telling you how old I am now as well. So focus on ecological security. We've done a lot of work at SIPRI and with other institutions, Woodrow Wilson in the US, Adelphi, Hamburg University, E3G in London, others, on climate change and its impact on insecurity. I think we've kind of feel fairly confident about saying that we've identified at least 4 pathways that lead from climate change to a heightened risk of armed conflict. And one of those is the impact of climate change on livelihoods. As livelihood insecurity rises, inequalities rise, grievances rise, there's the possibility of political mobilization, conflict entrepreneurs step in, and if not careful, you're on a really bad road. The second one is much more to do with the mobility of people and migration. It's people leaving areas because the habitat becomes less habitable. Those places where they arrive, they're not welcome. This issue is not, in my view, primarily or even significantly an issue of international migration as from the global south to the global north. It is primarily an issue of migration from the countryside to the city, and sometimes it's trans-border. It's from one country to a neighboring region in the next door country. But it's not the intercontinental migration which worries so many people in Europe. The third pathway involves the tactics which insurgents can use to and exploit situations created by climate change. In Pakistan, I'm not sure about last year's floods, but in an earlier set of floods in 2010-2011 period, who was it who turned up first to help the people? That was Taliban in Pakistan. In Somalia, who is it who too often turns up first to help the people when there's a flood? It's Al-Shabaab. And when organizations like that do that, when they turn up first, they provide real service, then they increase their credibility, they increase their attractiveness, and so on. And the fourth area is because, the fourth pathway is because of the capacity for the ruling elites, the privileged, to exploit the conditions that are created by climate change to their own advantage, again, feeding grievance and feeding inequalities of power. But alongside of that set of challenges as a result of climate change, I want to contribute to you now my 5 nightmares. So I'm really, this is the first time, or the second time I've been giving this talk, and I realized the first time I gave a part of this talk, which was on Monday to the staff at SIPRI. And it's really, I'm really sorry, but some of it is really kind of unsettling. So the 5 areas are, first of all, to give you the headings: antimicrobial resistance, the physiological effects of pollution, the loss of nature's contribution to people, local and regional tipping points or regime change, and intrusive species. So antimicrobial resistance. A lot of people think about this in terms of antibacterial resistance and think about that in terms of the overuse of penicillin and antibiotic drugs in general. Right? Actually, AMR, antimicrobial resistance, including ABR, antibacterial resistance, has been identified in areas where there is no overuse of synthetic drugs. In fact, where antibiotic drugs have not been introduced at all into the natural environment. So they can emerge through natural interaction, it seems, to some degree at least, under the impact of climate change. Why are we worrying about AMR? The estimate in 2015 was that antimicrobial resistance, the death toll from it, is 500,000 people a year. It's actually more than from armed conflict. The projection is that by 2050 that becomes 10 million people a year. It's a very significant killer. But there's something worse. As I told you, this is one of the nightmares. Right? There's something worse, because the great thing about penicillin when it first started being used widely was the speed of recovery from illness. Something goes wrong with you, you go to the doctor, have some penicillin, come back if you're not better in a week. You didn't go back because you were better in 4 days. From things that had previously kept you under the weather for a month. So what happens if societies start returning to a pre-penicillin age? And also what happens in the militaries if wounds and injuries can no longer be treated so successfully by antibiotics? When penicillin was first widely used in the US Army during the Second World War, in the first year it reduced mortality from injuries by 15% in the first year, just straight. And after that, of course, the more antibiotics, they became more effective. So that's antimicrobial resistance. If you think about a society becoming less healthy, one of the things you should think about then is less economic performance. If you think about a society becoming less healthy and poorer, then perhaps you think about one becoming more unequal, with more grievances, with problems that were solved in my parents' time not being solved in my time, grievance, frustration, anger. Let's move on. The physiological effects of pollution. The thing which really gets me here, if I talk about nightmares, this is the one that grabbed my attention first. When we were doing the Environment of Peace report, which was up at the back, and you can take copies as you leave, we wanted to expand from just talking about climate change to talking about environmental pressures as well. And I'm not quite sure how really successful we were in doing that in the end, but one area that I came across as I was contributing my part of this report was indeed air pollution. According to the World Health Organization, more than 90% of the world's population breathes unhealthy air. What do we know about the physiological effects of unhealthy air? We know that it does a lot of harm to the throat and to the lungs, but actually it gets all through the body and into every organ, including into the brain, which is only an organ. And amongst the things which have been tracked, closely related to high levels of air pollution, is increased anxiety, increased depression, increased anger and aggression, increased violent crime, unpremeditated violent crime in particular, and sadly, in the most recent thing that I read in a study from Cambridge University, a decline in creativity and innovative capacity. So I'm sorry to be doing this to you, but imagine now a less healthy, poorer, angrier society in which there is less capacity to find out how to solve the problems which are being created simply by breathing in and out. There's a lot in this field of pollution that we don't really know about. Do you know how many chemicals are commercially available? According to the UN study, it's 40 to 60,000 worldwide. According to the EU, it's 100,000. According to an independent academic study, it's 350,000. So somewhere from 40 to 350,000. Do you know how many have been studied fully for their toxicology? On a US Centers for Disease Prevention and Control and Prevention, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention website, it lists all of those chemicals whose toxicology has been fully studied. Out of those, however many thousands there are, 199 have been fully studied. So there's a massive amount that we don't know about the physiological effects of chemical pollution, and chemicals also get everywhere. Plastics. Quite a lot is known and understood about the effects of big plastic pollution, plastic bags and so on. But about microplastics, much less. We know that they get into every part of our body. They have been identified in mother's milk, so they're passed into babies straight away. But there is an ongoing discussion about what the health effects are. Different views, and there's no consensus as yet. Let's move on again. Loss of nature's contribution to people. Pollinators. 75% of crops grown by humans need pollination. Pollinators, bees, other insects worldwide. Well, not worldwide, but in many regions of the world the numbers are declining, though in some regions they're actually increasing. And a completely different kind of protection contribution offered by nature is, for example, mangrove forests. In Myanmar, in the Irrawaddy Delta, when Cyclone Nargis hit, right, it was clear that where the mangrove forest still stood, people and their villages were protected. Where those forests had been cut down for development, for aquaculture and agriculture, people were unprotected and the loss of life was much worse. So nature contributes to us in all kinds of ways. About 4 billion people worldwide depend on natural medicines, natural products for their medicines. Something like 75%, maybe more, of drugs used for cancer treatment are either natural products, or if they're synthetic, they were first identified and they were kind of inspired by natural products. The question of local tipping points, which I mentioned earlier. I don't know if you've been following news from Australia recently. There's a river in the Darling River system now, which is the figure that's, I mean, nobody's counted them. There's 1 million dead fish. Right? There's a dead zone. The dissolved oxygen in the water is now no longer enough. The fish have died and they rise to the top. We find these dead zones sometimes in lakes, sometimes in rivers, sometimes in the sea. It's very hard for a natural regime to go back from that tipping point. When that happens, livelihoods get put at risk, food security is at risk, all kinds of things. The less healthy, poorer, less well-fed society. This is unfortunately the picture that we're building up for ourselves. And the last thing to just throw in there is the intrusive species. Seaweed. You all know about seaweed? Seaweed's been around a long time, 500 million years. 65 million years ago, a new strand seems to have emerged, sargassum. You know about the Great Sargassum Belt in the Atlantic now? It's 5,000 miles long, 8,000 kilometers long. It's kind of the Atlantic and the Caribbean. And it washes up in vast amounts onto beaches. And it's not just kind of huge, big, brown, ugly heaps of the stuff, but within 48 hours it starts to rot, and amongst the gases which it releases is hydrogen sulfide, which is dangerous. So it's smelly and it's extremely unhealthy. It hurts tourism, it hurts fishing, it hurts livelihoods. It's part of the contribution to this set of problems. So these are the 5 sets of ecological security risks. Right? What do we do in the face of this? How do we think about these things? We need to integrate the Venn diagram's gone, which is good. I said it was good. Thank you. But those 3 areas, they overlap. What I'm talking about in the ecological security sphere is creating problems in the human security sphere, which will create issues in the national security sphere if we don't manage to find ways to intervene in them. And I think that that's the first thing to think about, is none of this is actually inevitable. Even when these ecological security nightmare risks are unfolding, there is a pathway that needs to be, that a society moves along from the ecological problem through economic, through social, to political problems, and on to disaster. And at any point along that pathway, it is possible to intervene in order to head things off and into a better direction. That's why we talk about the pathways of climate risk. Right? Where can you intervene in terms of, for example, the example I gave of Al-Shabaab and the floods? Well, if the Somali government and the UN could be the first providers, if they could get to the site of the natural disaster quicker than Al-Shabaab, then their credibility increases. Then they become the more attractive one. Then they kind of elbow Al-Shabaab aside without even having to fight them. So there are always things that can be done. It's always possible to intervene. So, first of all, on ecological security, we need to know more. We need a really major, multinational, multi-year, multidisciplinary study of these problems. And the hard science research, where there are big gaps to fill in, we cannot wait for that in order to do the social science research. They need to go hand in hand. And in fact, policy responses have to come along before all of the answers are in. We need an integrated picture of ecology-related risks to go alongside the others, and this research needs to be forward-leaning. It needs to be looking to what is now and is unfolding in the future. And that means, oddly, for somebody from an institute which places a huge amount of emphasis on evidence and wants evidence-based policy, proof is a distraction. The search for proof about these things is a fruitless distraction. Because for proof you have to look to the past, and we're talking about risk. We're talking about today and what unfolds. And so instead of really firm evidence-based policy, what I want to offer you is the idea that we need to figure out how to do uncertainty-based policy. One place where that could be brought together, an important kind of institutional part within the government, is in a National Security Council. So I think that one has been set up in Sweden is a good step forward. I think there should be that kind of institution, but it needs to focus on the whole triangle or all three circles in the Venn diagram. And we need to be bringing together the different communities, the ones who think that hard security is, or national security is the big issue, the ones who think that human security is the big issue, and the environmental sector, all need to be coming together. We all need a little bit of humility about what our preoccupations have been in the past in order to address the problems of the present and of tomorrow. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dan. So in that spirit, we can do a first move to that and join all on stage here. Robert, if you're sitting here, yeah, there. And basically, yes, Lina and Robert, you are part of these, you're representing these key players in these respective security communities, and we're doing a first step here. We're coming together, we're thinking security. What Dan has obviously put out a bandwidth of issues and a darkening horizon. What are your immediate reactions?
Well, there's a lot of reactions and thoughts, and I'm just trying to wrap my head around what he's actually saying here, because we saw a great model of how to think about security, and I think we're getting back to the very foundations of what security means. That's really what you're getting at. We're trying to define security, and that means asking the fundamental questions rather than the obvious ones. So whose security are we actually talking about when we say our insecurity? What is the threat? And perhaps most importantly, who is the provider of security? And as Dan rightly pointed out, we've tended to think about these things in national security terms. And that means the state as the foundation of threat and security. And that would be perhaps, I'm trying to be, put my academic hat and my critical glasses on, and that means that would perhaps be my only real challenge to this, that we're putting national security, human security, and ecological as three sort of equivalents, while one is actually not real, and that's the state and national security. That's just a human construction. We created them for security purposes, and now they're a problem, but they're also a potential solution. So we need to think very hard about that one, and not in equal ways as we think about human security and ecological security, I think. And ecological security is, I guess, never a solution either. It's not an actor, while humans are. So they are different, these three spheres, but we can come back to that. Yeah. But that was some of my first thoughts in a way. Yeah.
And Lina, your first reaction to the picture Dan is painting?
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, I'm trained as an ecologist, but I've always been interested in people. So for me, the reason to study ecology and understand the biosphere and ecosystems is because I want to understand how we as people can live a good life on this planet. So in some ways, I think these are the type of issues, the nightmares that you're painting, those are the type of issues that I've been worrying about for such a long time. So it's really interesting to see that now coming into security discussions. And I was thinking, who are the providers of those? Like you were saying, the state is a provider of the national security. In some ways, it is the biosphere that's a provider of these ecological functions on which we depend on. But how can we then, as people, become a better steward of the biosphere and all of those services that and benefits that it maintains? So I think, I think it's a really important part of the security picture. I kept thinking also when I was sitting here, like what are then some of the main sort of threats to that security as we are changing the biosphere? And I think one of the things is this growing also inequality on this planet, also in terms of both who are actually using the resources or having the most impact on the climate. And that is one part of the population globally that through their resource use is kind of using up this the available resources or the climate space. And then the impacts of that resource use actually falls very unequal also globally. So it's other part of the world that are bearing the cost of this resource use. Often it's not the same people.
No.
And then at the same time, many of the areas that bear the highest cost of climate change, for example, or invasive species or so on, also have the lowest capacity to adapt. So this kind of unequal resource use, unequal impacts and unequal adaptive capacity is also something that is creating this new security tensions. And I think that's also something we need to be better at addressing.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, you can have a spinning head for less. It's really complex, and just hearing you also reacting to it, it's very difficult where to start. But where do you think, from your end, the communities you're normally talking to, would that resonate? What Dan is putting out? Would you feel? Yeah, there's an urgency to make that point, and where would you see would be the difficulty to get that across?
I think
Dan
sort of described my community quite well in that there's sort of a sigh of relief almost. Okay, finally back to the core issues. Let's forget about all of these other human security threats and what have you. It's Russia and it's the threat of war. That's what we need to focus on, and then perhaps a bit of sort of civil protection kind of or civil defense capabilities to create a robust society. And if that is also useful for ecological security, then great. That's a bonus effect, but that's just a bonus. What we need to focus on is traditional security. And it's hugely problematic.
But isn't it fair also to pick up where people are in their most immediate concern right now, maybe? Or is that...
Well, the question is also, what is the most immediate? And I think that's something Dan is getting at as well. That yes, there is something going on right now that really captures our attention. In some ways, it's because it's closer. Ethiopia, it was mentioned as well, that is going on at the same time. But yes, it's truly immediate in the sense that it's an enormously important political challenge at this particular point, and a human security challenge, obviously. But is it therefore more important or more immediate than ecological security? Well, I continue, despite representing the hard or national security community here, for me the great challenge of our time is and will be ecological security or climate change. That is the foundation on which everything else rests. If we don't have a planet that sustains life, then all the rest is moot. That's just a fact. And so without that, we cannot build the infrastructure and the societies that provides sort of the top of the pyramid of states and their citizens with security. So, I don't know what is more immediate than the other in that sense.
And Lina, your communities, do they see that they're holding the security future in their hands?
I think they're starting to see that, or seeing the role of sort of the ecological agenda in the security issues. But it's coming up fairly recently. So I think it's come up, I would say, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, people started to couple more and more human health and ecological health as one way also of kind of connecting how we, the importance of these aspects. And I think now recently, over the past 5-6 years, it's really sort of security is coming up much more. And I think one place where you can see this shift is also in the IPCC work, so these assessments of the evidence of climate change, and how that has moved from first just being about sort of the physical climate sciences and climate impact into much more bringing in both nature and ecology, human adaptation, and starting to connect it even to security issues. So I think that's also, you can see that kind of move in that type of work. Yeah.
Dan, does that seem, do you think you have landed with your argument so far?
Well, I mean, to some extent, I think I sort of have to confess, I'm not quite sure what the argument is. Right? So
That's reassuring to hear.
Yeah, I'm still working that out. I mean, if I tell you sort of my trajectory into this is to be writing about the twin crises of security and the environment, and looking for their intersections, and coming across some which I realize some intersections are just not part of the discussion at all. I mean, I haven't heard a discussion which says, look, 70% of the world's population is going to be living in cities, 90% of us breathe unhealthy air, and we all know that air tends to be unhealthier in cities than it is out in the countryside. Air pollution is related to these things: crime, feelings, poor decision making, other things which I didn't go into in my talk because I don't like depressing people despite all of the appearances. And this surely should be discussed within a crime and policing context, a human security context, indeed a risk of upheaval and so on. All of those contexts that we're talking about now. And that conversation isn't happening. So then I have met somebody, a co-author, who knows much more about the science than I does, who seems to be a weird combination of biochemist and physicist all in one go. And we've produced a paper together which covers these 5 urgent questions that I was talking about. And at the end of that, what we say is, look, we need to know more. So beyond saying we need to know more about this, I'm not sure what that argument about ecological security actually is. Beyond what Robert said, which with no disrespect is kind of the obvious, which is that our lives are, the foundation of our life is natural. Societies are based on natural foundations, and if that foundation is crumbling, everything else will crumble along with it.
Yeah. Lina, you wanted to react directly.
Well, I think it was both this and what you were relating to also, this kind of need to be able to both respond on short-term crises and keep sort of the long-term goals in mind at the same time. And that there is, how can we stay on track on trying to achieve when we need to go when we're faced with all these immediate crises. And I think what you see there is sometimes it's also the rise of misinformation, polarization, and lobbying. So just as an example, now with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, and Ukraine and Russia being so important for global food security because so much of the food and bread basket, one of the big bread baskets in the Ukraine region, right? So what happens when that happened? One of the first sort of moves by some of the political players are saying, okay, now we need to ramp up food production in the rest of the world because we have this, we can't rely on this breadbasket anymore. Therefore, we need to reduce some of our climate ambitions in agriculture because we need to make food the priority. So what you're forgetting in that argument is that actually, when you're looking at the food system, what scientists have been saying for a while now is that if we were moving the food system to become both more sustainable and more healthy, we need to, for example, eat much more plant-based food. We can't have as much grains going into feed. We need to reduce food loss and waste, make food system more circular, etc. It's not that we need to maintain the amount of grains that we're producing globally. So I think that's an interesting argument. So instead of thinking, okay, this is actually the time now to rapidly switch into a more sustainable transformation, it would go hand in hand with making us more self-reliant, a healthier food system, a more sustainable food system. People are immediately going back to kind of let's produce more. And I think that's a bit of like what happens in this, that we need to kind of maintain this long-term trajectory of where do we have the win-wins that are like creating multiple synergies across sectors. Yeah, I don't know, it was a bit of a detour, but it's kind of, I think that's where some of the conflict lies and risks, but also the opportunities.
Yeah. Robert, you
I was just
want to
thinking
agree?
about that we have to highlight the importance of politics in all of this. Because if it was that obvious that we need to protect our environment because it sustains everything that on this planet, then surely we can still cooperate on those issues despite the most recent political squabbles, right? But no. Suddenly we are raising barriers between us. We're producing a multipolarity. We're not cooperating on the great challenges of our time, which means that if we look at it from the other side, you know, the impact of war on all the rest. I mean, suddenly we can't do what we have to do as a global society. And that means if we overlook traditional hard security, then we'll find ourselves in real troubles.
Yeah, there was anyway an aspect I was curious to see how you look into this, but I just also wanted to say in a moment I really would like to bring in you as well, the audience, you're sort of the society. So think about your questions. I will turn to you in a moment with this fantastic microphone. But meanwhile, I wanted to hear how you think this complexity, this new security space. How would we look after that? How would we govern that? You mentioned the politics. Like, what institutions do we have to look after this complexity? We seem to have agencies for each and every single element to it. But who's looking after the picture in general? Maybe Dan, because you put us into this position here. If you have
I'm responsible for getting
your vision here first.
First of all, I think there's a question which is kind of being implicitly asked, which is almost reducible to saying, what kind of society is it that knows how to look after itself?
Yeah.
Right? So what kind of education would you need in that society? Given that we can't get, and probably don't want to try to get, complete equality between everybody, what degree of social and economic differentiation is okay for a society that should know how to look after itself? What kind of political discourse would you have in a society which knows how to look after itself? In that sense, I mean, you could, the buzzword which is used all the time is, of course, resilience. But it's not resilience as a quality which you build through a resilience building program. It's something much bigger than that. And then the question is, well, what kind of political parties or political actors or governments stand up for a society to help develop a society that knows how to look after itself? And what kind of institutions then make sense in that? And I think, some of it is that we need to be breaking down the silos that there have been, not breaking down the competence which exists within those silos, but making it possible for different competences, different specialities to talk to each other, both in terms of knowledge and in terms of policy. So, for example, a society which knows how to look after itself would not say the top-ranked ministry is the economy, finance, they look after everything. Lower down the food chain, you've got environment, women, and all that stuff. Right? Because that's not a society which knows how to look after itself. And yet in most countries, the finance ministry is the real plum. That's the one that the most ambitious politician who isn't yet president or prime minister goes after. Right? So there's a lot of things to think about in that simple little question that you just asked for. What are the key institutions? But I think that what we should be looking for now is institutional bridging, or things which bridge those different institutions, the different departments of state, the different faculties in universities, that bring together the different emphases in different UN agencies, and so on. That would be my first stab at answering the question.
Yeah, Nina, what would you say?
I think it's
easy,
difficult, right? Yeah. When you're speaking, I can't help thinking about the book that, I don't know if you read, this is a fiction book, but it's called The Ministry for the Future. It's written by Kim Stanley Robinson, who's a sort of science fiction writer, but very sort of ecologically grounded science fiction writer. In that book, I think it was in 2025, there was a new international body, the Ministry of the Future, set up to kind of make sure that the world was following the Paris Agreement. So it kind of just reminded me about that book. I actually don't. I'm not sure what is the best bodies. I do believe in processes such as IPCC, the IPBES, which is an intergovernmental panel on biodiversity and ecosystem services, and there are similar type of global scientific assessments. So in some ways we can't just wait for the science, but that kind of have this brings together the authoritative, what we know, evidence base for action, basically. I think they can become much more integrated. So now we have one on climate, one on biodiversity ecosystems. There are similar processes maybe being set up for food systems, etc. But can we bring it together in that is more around maybe human well-being and security and the ecological basis for that.
IPBES Biodiversity Assessment Report, that's the one which produced this kind of list of 18 categories of nature's contribution to people. Exactly. And that really starts to invite you, I think, to think in an integrated way in two senses. One is, what's the relationship between these categories, which is a kind of hard science question. And the second one is, what is the relationship of people to each of and all of these contributions? And that's more a social science kind of question. And both dimensions of that, both the hard science and the social science, need to be taken into account within a policy response that looks after trying to protect, enhance the biosphere, which we have been trampling on and trashing for a couple of centuries.
Yeah. Robert, would you come in?
It was sort of a future question, and in relation to what we're seeing right now. And what we're seeing right now are the ecological challenges that you are experts in, but we're seeing a war in Ukraine and an invasion by Russia. And to me, the violation on the system that Russia has committed is so great that I don't believe in the system yet anymore. Yeah. I think after every great war, there's a complete restructuring of the international system. And I'm wondering if this violation is great enough to be one of those upheaval sort of times in human history again, where we rethink all the questions that Dan raised. What kind of society does this, that, and that? How do we organize human beings on this planet to provide for security at all levels and to help us collaborate rather than fight? Because we know that there's human potential for both, right? And society is supposed to help us, not hurt us. And it seems to me the state system and the international organizations that we have, it's reached the end of its potential. It's easy to say. The hard thing is to be smart enough to answer Dan's questions. What would the alternative society look like at different levels? The local, regional, and the global level. How do we organize as human beings on this planet to provide for ecological, human, and whatever societal security that we might have? And to me, that's perhaps a bit of an opportunity as well as a really daunting task. But now we get to think about those questions again. So far, over the last few hundred years at least, we've strengthened the concept of the state and sovereignty to its absolute maximum, that you can get away with whatever anything if you're just a state and a member of the UN, especially if you're a permanent member of the UN Security Council. That means you can get away with absolutely anything.
Yeah.
Can we go back to the UN after this, when a permanent member has attacked a neighbor and caused them this amount of damage? I don't think so. What credibility does that organization still have if we pretend as nothing happened, right? So we need to think about these questions really quickly that you posed, Dan, because I've lost my belief in it. But it's the best that we have so far, right? Which means we have to protect it while we come up with an alternative one. But it might crumble very quickly, and that means we have to be able to answer the questions quickly as well.
Yeah, and it's also probably not very clear to us if we start on the local level and build from there up the global structure, or if we invent a better global structure and translate it down to the individual societies. So I guess there's work to be done. But I wanted to make sure that I give the word to our audiences. Do we have any questions here in the room right now? Please raise your hands. I will happily find you with the microphone. Giovanna, please just briefly introduce yourself.
I thought I'll break the ice. Hello, everyone. Thank you for this interesting discussion. My name is Giovanna Maletta, and I'm acting director of the Dual Use and Arms Trade Control Program at SIPRI. And I have a question that kind of was triggering to me when you talked about the provider of security. We are here to, in a way, to kind of trigger a discussion about maybe rethinking security. And my question is, to what extent into this thinking a non-Western perspective is integrated? Because of course, I think one of the issues of defining security is the fact that much of this thinking has been shaped so far also by Western scholars or Western governments, but especially after 2022, we are particularly aware that we live in a multipolar world where what we think we intended as Europe or Europeans or Western scholars think of what is security or insecurity might not match what other very important actors in the international order think of security. So just a question here to the whole panel on what is your opinion about that? Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanna. I think we let the panel directly react to that. If I start with you, Line.
Okay, thanks. I think it's a really important question, and I completely agree that there is so much also, both in science and in the way that we have defined the way we see the world here based on more Western values. And I think we need to have a shift in that. And I liked what you were talking about of how can we redefine security now after what we see in Ukraine. And I think if we really would be doing that, that needs to be much more of a global effort. But exactly how to do it, I'm not sure. But it's I just appreciated your comment, basically. Yeah.
Dan, do we have a Western bias?
Yeah, of course. You know, I mean, admittedly, I was born outside the UK, but I was brought up in the UK. I went to a leading university. That's my background. Yes, I'm British. There are all kinds of cognitive biases, some of which I recognize and many of which I don't. Right. So if there is to be a non-Western perspective in this discussion, it's not by me pretending to offer it. It is by a breadth of participation in the discussion. And for sure, if we're talking about at the level, Robert, of, you know, how do we organize human beings? As human beings, how do we organize human beings to live on this planet? That cannot be a discussion which effectively happens between Washington, Brussels, France, London, Berlin, Stockholm, etc. That has to be a very, very wide discussion. Yeah, no, I'll leave the answer there.
And Robert?
Yeah, there's an enormous bias, geographical one, but also I think cognitive one in terms of thinking about security in state terms, etc.
Are we too much in our bubbles?
We are, but the problem, of course, is that, again, it's about politics and it's about power. And who decides what security is and means is the one who holds the power. Because that means that's all resources flow from that question. That's how you organize society, by defining what security means. And that means we will always have a bias in favor of the powerful, in a way. So I think that should be part of the organizational problem. How do we distribute power in a more even way so that all constituencies will have a say rather than just a few, whether you are geographically or socially or ethnically sort of distributed between us.
Yeah. And the definition of security, would we be able to be more inclusive and have a wider definition, or who would define it for us wider? If we are not.
So I've been talking about human security for a long time, but not necessarily as it's defined in the United Nations system, but rather as an intellectual starting point for thinking about security. If you start out by asking human beings, what are you afraid of? What are your challenges? The rest will come from there. And that might sometimes lead you to ecological challenges, sometimes to very traditional security challenges, bombs and guns. But quite often it's much more mundane things like having a job, education, livelihood is something Dan talked about.
Yeah.
And those need to be fulfilled as well, otherwise society crumbles again.
Yeah. Do we have more questions from the audience? You are reflecting. I'm coming over to you.
Hi, my name is Alexandra. I work for the Swedish Armed Forces headquarters for the strategic analysis part. So nice to hear a little bit about the force part. But I actually have a question rather about the theme of this is thinking security. So we are planning or conducting an analysis on how the world might look in 20 years, 30 years. How far ahead are you guys thinking when you're talking about the future? So what's the definition for you when you talk about the future? And especially, Dan, when you are talking about the 3 different parts, would you dare to elaborate a little bit when you think the shift, when one could be more important in the future, when that would happen? I mean, you mentioned there was a study about 2050 and something like that. Just to put it in a context of what do you define the future to be?
Thank you.
Should I start?
Yeah, start.
So, first of all, as a kind of a qualification on answering that question, which is not the obvious one that I don't have a crystal ball, right? But I have a certain reservation about being very specific about the future, because I'm concerned that that distracts attention from people thinking about the problems as they are today. I mean, food insecurity is high today. Air pollution is high today. Climate change impact is real today. There was a lot of discussion in the climate change and environmental community. I mean, the easy thing to do was to talk about the world that we're leaving to our grandchildren. My grandchildren are alive today. So I don't want us to, when one talks about it like that, unfortunately there becomes a deferral of action. So I'm therefore a little bit reserved about answering the question. I think that, I mean, the AMR study was the one which I mentioned, was the projection of antimicrobial resistance death toll to 2050 would by then be 10 million a year. That's the projection, a model-based projection like all others, and therefore it will refine over time and it will be checked against the evidence as it unfolds. I think 2050 is close enough and far enough to be thinking about. I think it does give people an alibi for inaction when you talk about what will be happening to sea level in 2100. I'd rather have the dates come closer. I find it more telling when the IPCC tells me that by 2050, sea level surge events that used to be experienced once a century will be being experienced once a year on average, rather than to be told by 2080 or by 2100 the sea level will have gone up by 65 centimeters on average, whatever. Right? So I think mid-century, it's only 27 years from now. I can remember what I was doing 27 years ago, so 27 years doesn't seem like too long a time. I think also, I mean, a couple of years back, your predecessor in charge of SRC, Johan Rockström, co-authored a piece which looked at some climate tipping points being reached by 2050. There are certainly local regime tipping points have been reached already. Environmental tipping points have come and gone. So yeah, I think this next 2.5 decades is a really, really important period. But the thing is that if you think in terms of those 2.5 decades, don't think of, it's as if we're all kids, right? I mean, as well as my grandchildren, I also have a teenager. He's 13 years old, and he knows how to do his homework and when to do his homework, right? The night before it's due. And I'm trying to tell him, come on, think of doing it 4 days in advance, or a week. You've known for 3 weeks you have this assignment. We've known for 2 or 3 decades already that we have this assignment, but we've been putting off our homework. And to some degree, we just have to grow up. Yes, think ahead to 2050 and to what could go wrong if we don't start in 2023 on the right course of action. It's the same with the green economy, the green transition strategy. Set all the targets you like for 2040 or 2050. Translate those into targets for 2023 and start meeting them.
Yeah, that's a good point. I wanted to see, Marty, do we have online audiences as well to bring into the discussion?
Thank you very much. Yes, we have a couple of questions. One for Lina and Robert. How can the issues we discussed be integrated into education? So presumably you have very different education audiences at different ends of the spectrum. So that would be the first question. And the second one to the whole panel, and it ties in nicely with what Dan was saying about putting off our homeworks, I think. And it is, the climate science has been clear for many decades, but we don't see any meaningful action on climate change. How can we change policy to get action on risks that we have much less of an understanding of? Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe I can kick off with education. I think it's fundamental to start integrating it into education. I think it is being done partly, at least at different, I can see it with my kids in school. They're actually being educated on sustainability issues to a much more degree than what used to be the case. And we also have a set of different education programs at Stockholm University and Stockholm Resilience Center. So I think it is kind of happening. I think one area that we're exploring a bit is also how we can not both use the academic system to educate the next generation the next generation basically, but also how can we educate people in the private sector. We've had an executive education program to try to sort of reach CEOs of large companies to understand these issues, to mobilize action that way. This fall we're actually educating all the union leaders. So that's also quite interesting for us doing the kind of both sort of the CEOs and then the union leaders at the same time. So I think trying to think about the education also differently and in new ways, because we need not only to have the next generation acting on this, but also the current generation and people in power who have the power to act. So for academic organization also to reach out and work in new ways and new constellation, I think is important.
Yeah. And thank you, Lina. Yeah. How would the Defence University
first of all,
take this on?
I think the important thing is never to separate the different perspectives. Yeah. There's enough stovepipes. I think multidisciplinary approaches to security. Dan talked about a National Security Council as a way of combining the different, if you actually use the broader views of security. So that would be a good thing. And I think education would need to think about these things as well. I've had the pleasure of being on the board of a research program called Mistra Geopolitics for a number of years, and it involves most of the people in here, I think. And that was fascinating because you could see the climate community and the security community trying to do things together, and they've done it quite well, but at the same time these scholars publish in different journals, they are part of different communities. It's not working super well, that integration process. But there's one part of the program that is really exciting. Well, all of it is really exciting, to be honest, but one part in particular, and that's the research school. Because this is a new generation of PhD students who are growing up in this multidisciplinary environment. They will naturally understand these connections, and I think will be able to do things that we who have been taught in the stovepipes cannot even think about very well. Yeah. And that's really hopeful for me that you know there are ways of educating people to solve the problems of the future in a way.
Yeah. And Dan, what is your feedback on the second question? Yeah,
changing policy on risks about which we have less understanding. I mean, that's why I said we need to think, perhaps this is a little frivolous, but instead of just evidence-based policy, we need to think about uncertainty-based policy. Uncertainty-based policy, it seems to me, could be an approach which is similar to thinking about wicked problems and tame problems. I don't know if you're familiar with this line of thinking, but I mean, a tame problem is like a maths problem. The elements of it are fixed. The answer is always the same, and there's one right answer, and every other answer is wrong. Right? In wicked problems, the elements of it are not fixed. They change over time, and there is no right answer. There are just answers which are less good or worse, and that's actually most problems in life are like that. You know, we like to think that problems in life are tame, and that you get to the end of it and you say they all lived happily ever after the end. But actually we know that's not how life is. We go on, we create, we adapt, we get a bit better, we learn not to do that. And that's how policy actually is, but we often pretend that it's not. So we pretend that there is a certainty in what we're doing and actually don't acknowledge the uncertainties which are there, which we have learned to handle and to move on with. In the policy world, just as we do in the individual life. So I think it's interesting that you asked that question, Alexandra, coming from where you come, because one of the things that I would say is that in the military establishments or security establishments of several countries, you see this capacity to do integrative thinking, looking far ahead into an uncertain future, and saying not this is what will be and therefore, but saying this is what could be and therefore. Right? The DCDC, the Defence Concepts Doctrine Centre in the UK, there's a lot of thinking in the Pentagon about this. NATO is doing it. So the military sector, the security sector, is surprisingly, perhaps for people who are outside of it, it contains a surprising degree of flexibility and creativity in thinking about those things. The insurance industry also contains a surprising degree of capacity to integrate an understanding of different problems, think about how they come together, think about what the risks are, and how within a quite limited then frame of reference they respond to them. So what the insurance industry does is quite limited, but it does that limited thing on a broader foundation, which is quite interesting. So I am far from pessimistic about the proposition that policy needs to be made to address problems of which we have incomplete understanding, because we do it all the time.
Yeah, and if we look forward, then that's probably the new normal, that to embrace the uncertainty and make it work positively for us. Yeah. So we have room for one more question if there is. Yes?
Hello, hi. My name is Ruth Elizabeth, and I just started to study peace and conflict resolution. And it's so interesting to hear you all talking and the question that have been asked. And I had a question. You talked about the lack of trust or credibility in the UN and the West bias of the definition of security and like the need of a wider discussion of the security. But how do we get that? How do we get that wider perspective or the wider discussion of security? Are we there? Who should initiate that? Should the West kind of should I stop studying peace and conflict resolution as a Swedish girl, or who should initiate that, or how do we get that wide discussion?
Thank you, really. Yeah, Robert.
Who should initiate?
Why don't you start this time?
Again, so I'm sorry to repeat myself, but the human security approach means a bottom-up approach, and that means it's us, citizens, who should define security and have that discussion. I think we're having it all the time. I think the Fridays for Future movement is a huge popular rally in trying to define what security means. And we're seeing similar things on other issues around the world. And so the democracy and us human beings, and we just have to be more inclusive in that debate. Because if it's armchair strategies only in the national security councils in Western countries defining security, it's not going to be as good as it could.
Lina, do you agree?
No, I agree that it needs to be some more bottom-up, and maybe people in power need to be able to create the space for that to emerge also, those type of discussions. And I agree that we are at a place in time where I think this is something that many people, organizations, institutions around the world are really thinking about. So, I don't know, but I'm sure that something will emerge. So it's also about finding that, creating that space for it to do so. Yeah.
And Dan?
Yeah, I mean, one kind of word of warning which I have is when one thinks about non-Western perspectives, is to remember that outside of what we call the West, there is also a rich and powerful elite, which is often rapacious, nasty, repressive, and so on, but not always, just like in the West. Right? So it's the emphasis on the bottom up, which is, and then the diversity of that, which is the important thing. I mean, there are non-Western voices that can be heard, but which should be treated with a kind of a pinch of salt when it comes to redefining security. SIPRI's strategy for the last 4 or 5 years, and we're in a process now of rethinking our strategy, but we will keep this element of it. We basically asked ourselves some 4 or 5 years ago, what did we want to see? And of course we want to see world peace, but when you're designing a strategy for a small research institute in Sweden, that's a kind of dumb goal to put for yourself. Good goal for the world, but dumb for SIPRI. So what we said, well, what is a step towards that that we could imagine that would be creative and helpful and is within our reach to play a part in? And the formula that we came up with was we want to see a global conversation on the issues that we take seriously, starting from premises that we can support, like respect for international law, that treaties when signed should be agreed to, that it should be diverse, that it should have mutual respectability, mutual respect for each other. And what we thought was that what we can contribute to that is both our research and disseminating it, so that can be part of, not the only part, but a part of the global conversation, and also our convening power, that we can bring people together, and then that we also take part in conversations, dialogues, meetings, conferences that others are convening and organizing as well. So I think there is not an answer to the question of who should start it, except to say, well, as many as possible. It should be diverse, it should be mutually respectful, it should take certain values seriously, but not kind of set conditions on who participates.
Yeah, thanks. And as we are so slowly approaching the end of at least today's thinking on security, I just wanted to make sure that I don't leave you in the audience with the gloomy picture which we have been painting today. We've been having a lot of initiates for thoughts, but I wanted to let all of you close by giving me your piece of hope in this, and what you would like to, what you take the energy to move on, and where your road ahead would be going from here. So if we do the reverse, or we do the same order again, and we let Dan close the gloomy picture. And Robert, I let you have your piece of hope first. Is there anything which you find hopeful?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is difficult times bring out the best in people. So through the most horrific wars, we have also seen the greatest scientific achievements and societal changes to the international system and societies. We saw during the pandemic first the ugly side of the international system as they competed for resources and trying to shut borders, etc. But then you also saw a tremendous level of collaboration between society, business, and states solving this problem. So I'm convinced that we have the capacity to solve it. It's just the horrible thought of what it will take for us to bring out the best in us when it comes to these great challenges. And can we be a little less than our teenagers sort of doing their homework on the very eve of destruction, so to speak, or the test? Or can we be a little smarter than that and plan for a difficult future?
Yeah.
But I know we have the capacity as human beings to solve these issues.
Yeah, thanks. Lina?
No, I really love that take on it, and that this is a time where we really can sort of think through how do we want to live as humans on this planet, and how can we contribute to a better world for everyone. I think it's a new sort of time to do that in. It also sort of reminds me about talking with chefs. So I work a lot on the food system and the needed shifts in the food system. And when you talk with chefs, really good chefs, what they really thrive on is sort of constraints in their free creativity. If you tell them you only have these few ingredients to create an interesting dish from, that's where their imagination starts. And it's so interesting to see these chefs like take on, for example, the challenge of how do we create a more healthy and sustainable food system. So in some ways, I really agree with this. It's also with constrained resources that our imagination can start flowing. So maybe we should learn a little bit of what's going on in some of these top kitchens, of like how we actually can create a desirable and attractive future. That would be sort of a hope from the kitchen side. Yeah.
Thank you, Lina. And Dan?
Yes, two things. One is that I can't remember the exact year, but I think it must be about 1968 or 69, that there was a hit song in England called The Eve of Destruction. Yeah? Some others, were there at the right time when stuff was really cool. Barry Maguire, that's right. Yeah. And I'm not going to sing it, don't worry. And it was, we were thinking this kind of thought then. In other words. So we have confronted tough stuff. Yes, the challenges now are, as I said at the beginning, some of them are unprecedented, therefore the combinations of challenges are unprecedented. But as Robert has been saying, and as Lina has emphasized there as well, with examples from high and low, in a sense, you can see that there is this capacity for innovation and creativity. The last thing which I want to say is I want to bring some message of hope to those who are dispirited, not by me, but by Robert, saying that he no longer trusts or believes in the United Nations. Because I agree that the UN Security Council looks as if it could be as seriously hobbled as it was during the Cold War. But I think one of the interesting things and hopeful things is that a set of institutions, a family of institutions, has been created, especially strengthened in the years since the Cold War. I mean, you think about the funds and programs, the agencies, and the work which they're doing. Some of it is tremendous. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, is doing heroic work in relation to Zaporizhia. UN envoy Hans Grunberg was able to bring about or facilitate a ceasefire in Yemen. Last year, at last, in the Conference of Parties on the Climate Change Agreement, the question of loss and damage got raised and addressed. Even within the Security Council, they're still able to renew the peace operations mandates. So there are signs of health in that institution or set of institutions, despite the appalling kicking that it's been receiving. And I think that is itself an important sign of hope when we think towards the integrated challenges in the field of security.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. Unfortunately, our time for today has been running out, but I'm afraid we keep on, and we will need to keep on thinking security for the future from here. But I would like to thank you for this engaging discussion, and thanks also for our great panelists here to guiding us through the discussion, and our audiences online. Thank you for being with us today. Welcome again to SIPRI in a future event, and a great evening to you all. Thank you.